I never expected to become a farmer at 35, but when that certified letter arrived claiming the HOA owned mineral rights to my grandfather's land, I knew something wasn't right, especially when I discovered their president had forged documents while Grandpa was in the hospital. How would I stand up against a powerful HOA determined to steal my family's farm right out from under me? Comment below where you're watching from. I stared at the certified letter in my hands, my coffee growing cold beside me. This must be a mistake, I whispered. To the empty kitchen, the paper trembled slightly as I read it again. According to the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association, they owned all mineral rights to my grandfather's farm, my farm now, and planned to start digging up my land. In just 4 weeks, Grandpa's funeral was barely 2 months ago. After he passed, I'd left my cramped apartment in Seoul, crushing accounting job in the city to take over his 15-acre property in Willow Creek. The farm had been in our family for 3 generations. I'd spent every childhood summer here helping him tend the peach orchard, gathering eggs, and learning how the land breathes with the seasons. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. After being transferred 3 times, a clipped voice answered. Margaret Holloway speaking. HOA President Miss Holloway, I'm calling about this letter claiming your association owns mineral rights to my property. There must be some confusion. No confusion at all, Mr. Mitchell. Your grandfather signed the agreement 2 years ago. Our geological survey found significant limestone deposits beneath your eastern field. The excavation begins next month. The paperwork is quite clear. My grandfather would never. Perhaps you didn't know him as well as you thought. She interrupted. The agreement is legally binding. Good day. I sat stunned as she hung up outside my kitchen window. Morning light spilled across the fields. Grandpa had worked his entire life. He taught me everything about this land, how to read the soil, when to plant which trees needed extra care. He'd sooner cut off his own hand than sign away any part of this farm. That afternoon I drove to the edge of my property where it bordered Sycamore Heights. The development was only 5 years old. Rows of identical 2-story houses with perfect lawns and identical mailboxes, so different from the weathered beauty of Grandpa's farmhouse. A woman was gardening in the yard closest to my fence line. She straightened when she saw me approach. You must be Tom's grandson, she said, pulling off her gloves. I'm Elaine Watson. I'm so sorry about your grandfather. He was a wonderful neighbor. Did you know him well? I asked. As well as anyone, I suppose. He brought me fresh peaches every summer. Her eyes darted to her front door before she added in a lower voice, be careful with that hoe. Margaret's had her eye on your property since they broke ground here. What do you mean? Elaine glanced around again. She's always talking about expanding the community footprint. Your grandfather refused to sell even when they offered him well above market value. A car door slammed nearby. Elaine quickly put her gardening gloves back on. I should get back to my flowers. The HOA only allows certain improved plants. Got cited last month for unauthorized hostess. She forced a laugh as I walked back toward my house. A silver SUV cruised slowly past. The driver, a stern-faced woman with immaculate gray hair, stared at me with undisguised interest. That night I couldn't sleep. I pulled out Grandpa's old metal filing cabinet and started digging through decades of paperwork, tax forms, equipment receipts, seed catalogs, Nothing about mineral rights around 2 a.m. I found a folder labeled Property. Documents containing the original deed. From 1963, when my grandfather bought the place from the Wilson family. I read every line carefully. The deed explicitly stated that all mineral rights conveyed with the property, with no provisions for separation. According to this, no one but the property owner could claim those rights. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The clerk, an older man named Frank with reading glasses perched on his nose, helped me search through property records. Here's the original deed, he said, pointing to a document that matched what I'd found in Grandpa's cabinet. And here's the property tax history, building permits, boundary adjustments when they put in the county road in '87. What about any transfer of mineral rights? I asked. Frank adjusted his glasses. Let me check. Huh, that's odd. He turned his computer screen so I could see it. There is a mineral rights transfer filed 2 years ago, signed by Thomas Mitchell, transferring all subsurface rights to the Sycamore Heights Community Development Corporation. My stomach dropped. Can I see the actual document? Frank printed a copy. There it was, a legal-look document with what appeared to be my grandfather's signature at the bottom, dated April 15th, 2022. But something felt wrong. I studied the signature closely. Do you have any other documents my grandfather signed on file for comparison? Frank found a property tax appeal from 5 years ago. When he laid the documents side by side, I could see subtle differences in the signatures. Grandpa's distinctive looping T was missing from the mineral rights transfer. As I drove home, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Susan, Grandpa's youngest sister. I got your message, she said, about Grandpa supposedly signing over mineral rights. Did he ever mention anything about it to you? Never. And Tom, there's something else you should know. I was looking through my calendar from that time, April 15th, 2022. That's when the document was supposedly signed. Right. Yes, your grandfather was in the hospital then. He had his stroke on April 2nd and wasn't released until the 27th. He couldn't even hold a pen for weeks afterward. I visited him every day. There's no way he signed anything on the 15th. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The signature is forged. It has to be. What are you going to do? I pulled into my driveway and stared at the farmhouse. Golden light bathed the porch where Grandpa and I had shelled peas and watched fireflies on summer evenings. Whatever it takes, I said. This farm stays in our family. As the sun set, I noticed a drone hovering over my eastern field, the area where the HOA claimed valuable limestone deposits existed. When I walked toward it, the drone quickly retreated toward Sycamore Heights. They were watching me, planning their move, but now I knew something they didn't. Their claim was based on a forgery. The question was, how could I prove it before their bulldozers arrived? In less than 4 weeks, teaches geology at the State University. I said he could analyze soil samples. Perfect. James nodded. Meanwhile, I can reach out to former colleagues about the forgery angle. We'll need a handwriting expert. Sarah pulled out her laptop. And I can help with public awareness. I run a local blog with decent readership. If we document everything they can't silence all of us. For the first time since receiving that certified letter, I felt hope. I wasn't alone anymore. As we left the coffee shop, Sarah grabbed my arm. Wait, she whispered, pointing to a sedan parked across the street. A woman with perfectly coiffed gray hair sat inside, pretending to check her phone. That's Margaret, we ducked back inside. She followed me here. I realized she knows we organized. This changes our timeline, James said grimly. If Margaret knows we're challenging her, she might accelerate her plans. What should we do, Sarah asked. I thought about Grandpa, about his weathered hands working that land for decades, about the promise I'd made to keep the farm in our family. We fight back. I said, first thing tomorrow I'm calling my geologist friend. If there's no valuable limestone on my property, why is Margaret so desperate to get her hands on it? What's she really after? None of us noticed the small red light blinking in the coffee shop's corner, a security camera capturing our entire meeting, streaming directly to a computer in Margaret Holloway's home office. I jumped at the knock on my door. It was almost 9 p.m. Through the peephole I saw a woman about my age nervously glancing over her shoulder. I'm Sarah Thompson, she said when I opened up. I live in the house with the blue shutters that backs up to your east field. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I need to talk to you about the HOA. They're not just after your land, they're making all our lives a nightmare. I invited her in, offering fresh-picked peach tea. Sarah's story poured out between sips. Margaret Holloway ran the Sycamore Heights HOA like her personal kingdom. Sarah had planted native wildflowers to help local bees. The next day, Margaret slapped her with a $500 fine when I showed her the approved plant list that included wildflowers. She just laughed, Sarah said, her hand shaking slightly. She told me the board had changed the rules last month. When I asked to see the new rules, she threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay up within 48 hours. I pulled out the forged document with my grandfather's signature. Look at this. April 15th last year, my grandfather was in the hospital after a stroke. He couldn't even hold a spoon, let alone sign his name. Sarah's eyes widened. You know you're not the only one with a story. My neighbor Tom found out they've been charging us all for landscaping services on the north side walking path, but that path doesn't exist. 2 nights later, my kitchen table was surrounded by 7 neighbors from Sycamore Heights. Each person carried their own grievances against Margaret: excessive fines, weird rule changes, and money that disappeared from the HOA accounts. Last month they collected $115,000 for a playground renovation, said Elaine, a kindergarten teacher. The only renovation was a fresh coat of paint on the old swing set. Where did the rest go? James Rodriguez, a retired attorney with thick glasses and carefully combed gray hair, studied my documents. His finger traced over my grandfather's supposed signature. This is textbook fraud, he said, looking up at me. The problem is proving it in court. Margaret's brother-in-law sits on the county commission. They've got no way with shady deals before because they have friends in high places. Rain tapped against the windows as we outlined our battle plan. James would help me prepare a legal challenge. 3 others would dig into the HOA financial records. They had rights as members to request them. Sarah and Elaine would quietly talk to more neighbors, building our support. We need to know why they really want this land. James said, I don't buy the limestone story. There must be something more valuable thereafter. I nodded, remembering something. I have a college friend, Professor Wilson, who teaches environmental geology. I'll ask her to check if there's actually anything valuable in the soil here. We left my barn close to midnight. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sweet with the smell of wet earth as my new allies headed to their cars. Headlights suddenly flashed from down the road, a black sedan I didn't recognize through the darkness. I caught the glint of binoculars when I started walking toward them. The car engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as it sped away. What was that? Sarah asked, freezing in place. A chill ran up my spine. Someone watching us. We need to be careful. Margaret has eyes everywhere. Do you think they heard our Plans Elaine whispered. I don't know, I admitted, but we need to move fast. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my grandfather's old porch swing thinking about how he'd fought in 2 wars to protect his country, only to have his land stolen through lies while he lay in a hospital bed. The anger burning in my chest hardened into determination. I wouldn't just fight back, I would win. I didn't know then how quickly Margaret would strike, or how dirty she was. Willing to play by sunrise, our rebellion would face its first real test. James' words kept echoing in my head. They want something on this land, something worth committing fraud for, but what could be so valuable that they'd risk criminal charges? What was Margaret Holloway really after? As first light broke over the eastern fields, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Emergency HOA meeting called for tonight. Topic: security measures for neighborhood boundaries. Something's happening, be ready. I stared out at my grandfather's land, the covered fields shimmering in the dawn light. Whatever game Margaret was playing, she had just made her next move, and somehow I needed to be 2 steps ahead of her. The question wasn't if they would strike back, but when and how hard. I slammed on my brakes, mouth hanging open. A huge chain and padlock secured my front gate with a bright orange notice plastered across it: property access restricted pending mineral excavation preparations. 2 burly men in matching black uniforms stood beside a shiny black SUV, arms crossed. Excuse me, I called out, stepping from my truck. This is my property. You need to remove that lock right now. The taller guard barely glanced at me. We have orders from the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. No entry without proper authorization. Authorization? I own this farm. My voice cracked as anger surged through me. Take it up with Miss Holloway, the second guard said, handing me a business card. We just doing our job. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Sheriff Martinez. While waiting, I paced the dusty road, watching these strangers walk freely on my land while I couldn't even check on my chickens or water my vegetables. 20 minutes later, the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, gravel crunching under its tires. Sheriff Martinez, a stocky man with kind eyes that looked everywhere but at me, reviewed the paperwork the guards handed him. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice low. They filed the proper documents yesterday. According to this, they have legal access rights for surveying based on a forged signature. I protested. The sheriff sighed. That's for a court to decide. For now, these papers are in order. He must have seen the devastation on my face, because he added quietly, get yourself a good lawyer fast, and I'd suggest you document everything. Then I need a copy of all that paperwork. Exit. That would connect directly to Sycamore Heights. It would increase property values by at least 30% overnight. What does that have to do with my farm? I asked. The only viable route for this exit would cut through what's currently your eastern field, the part that borders Sarah's backyard. They need your land for road access, not minerals. Suddenly it all made sense. This wasn't about limestone. It was about money, millions in increased property values. Margaret stood to make a fortune on her own 3 investment properties in Sycamore Heights, plus whatever kickbacks she might get from developers. How do we fight this? I asked, my mind racing. We go public, James said firmly. Local news, social media, everything. Margaret wants to operate in the shadows. Let's drag this whole scheme into the light. That night we crafted our plan. Sarah contacted her cousin, who worked at the local TV station. James prepared legal documents challenging the forged mineral rights transfer. I gathered old photos of my grandfather working the land, including ones from April 2022 showing him in his hospital bed, clearly unable to sign anything. As I finally fell into an exhausted sleep on my friend's couch, since I still couldn't access my own house, my phone pinged with one last Message from Ellen Margaret just sent in. Email construction crews arriving Monday. To begin preliminary excavation on your eastern field, we only have 4 days to stop this. 4 days to save my grandfather's legacy. 4 days to expose a fraud that reached into the county government itself. The odds seemed impossible, but as I drifted off to sleep, I remembered something my grandfather used to say: the tallest oak in the forest was once just a little nut that held its ground. It was time to hold my ground, and Margaret Holloway had no idea what she was really up against. My hand shook as I unlocked the chains I had secretly put around my tractor last night. The security guards watching my farm hadn't noticed me sneaking out before dawn. I climbed up, started the engine, and drove straight toward my padlocked front gate, where news vans were already gathering. "That's far enough," yelled one guard, rushing forward with his hand up. I cut the engine and stood up on the tractor seat. "This is my property, and today everyone will learn the truth." Camera crews pointed their equipment my way as I held up folders of evidence. Neighbors from Sycamore Heights gathered behind the reporters, many holding homemade signs saying HOA fraud and support local farms. For weeks the Sycamore Heights HOA has claimed they own mineral rights to my family farm. I called out loudly. They locked me out of parts of my own land. They threatened me with legal action, but I've discovered what they're really after. I spread a large county map across my tractor hood. This isn't about limestone deposits, it's about this proposed highway exit that would make their properties worth millions more, but only if they can steal my eastern field. A black SUV screeched to a halt, and Margaret Holloway stormed out, her face red as a tomato. She wore an expensive suit and looked ready for battle. "Turn those cameras off right now," she demanded. "This man is trespassing on HOA property." Actually came a voice from the crowd. "He's standing on his own land." Professor Wilson stepped forward in his tweed jacket. "I've completed extensive soil testing. There are no valuable mineral deposits here, just regular farmland. The HOA's geological sir is completely fabricated." Margaret's eyes dotted around, noticing how many of her own HOA members were present. "We have legal documentation of the mineral rights transfer his grandfather signed it. I jumped down from the tractor on April 15th last year when he was in the hospital after a stroke. When doctors confirmed he couldn't even hold a pen, I pulled out hospital records and handed copies to reporters. "That's not just the lie, Miss Holloway. That's criminal forgery." Whisper spread through the crowd. A local news reporter thrust a microphone toward Margaret. "Miss Holloway, how do you respond to these forgery allegations? This is absurd." "I never," she stammered, backing toward her SUV. James Rodriguez, the retired attorney, stepped forward with more papers. "We've obtained bank records showing HOA funds were transferred to a private account to pay for this scheme. Nearly $200,000 is missing from the association's accounts." Sarah Thompson moved to the front of the crowd. "As residents, we never approved this. The board never even told us about it." Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulled up, followed by 2 deputies. Margaret saw them and suddenly lunged toward me, jabbing a finger in my face. "You stupid farmer, do you have any idea who you're dealing with? My brother-in-law runs this county." The sheriff approached slowly. "Not anymore. He does. Commissioner Holloway resigned this morning after we shared evidence with the ethics committee." Margaret's face drained of color. "This is a mistake. I can explain everything. You'll have plenty of time for that," Sheriff Martinez said, nodding to his deputies. "Margaret Holloway, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement of HOA funds." As the deputies led her toward their car, she twisted around. "You'll never win. Our lawyers will bury you. This farm will be bulldozed by summer." I watched calmly as they drove away, but my Heart was pounding, the reporter swarmed. Around me asking questions, neighbors came to shake my hand. We had won this battle, but Margaret's threats weren't empty. Her family had deep pockets and powerful friends. That night, as I finally returned to my farmhouse, Sarah called with disturbing news. Someone broke into the HOA office and took all the financial records, she said, her voice shaking. And I just drove past your orchard. There's a bulldozer parked at the edge of your property. I looked out my window into the darkness. Headlights appeared on my private drive, moving slowly toward my house. One vehicle, then three more behind it. They're not waiting for the courts, I whispered into the phone. They're coming now. If you like this video, please like, subscribe my channel for more exciting videos.